And we're back at the nervous system with lab 24. And in lab 24, we'll be looking at a few different things. We'll be examining a mid-sagittal view of the brain, so examining some of those internal structures. We'll also take a look at the spinal cord, and we'll get into those infamous cranial nerves. So first, a mid-sagittal view of the brain. It lets you get a look at some of those brain regions that you couldn't previously see very well. So some things that you already should know about, you should be able to identify the telencephalon with the cerebral cortex. So all of this is telencephalon. And then you know about the diencephalon, this region here, with the hypothalamus and the thalamus. What you'll also be able to see is you can get a better view of the midbrain, that mesencephalon or mesencephalon, and a look at, what color have I not used? Some of these structures, the metencephalon, that's here and here. And you'll be able to see the myelencephalon. What is, here we go. The myelencephalon down here, the medulla oblongata. So we'll take a look at some of the features of these different brain regions. So ones that you should know from the telencephalon, you should be able to see the cerebrum, and that's all of these folded structures here. So you can see the gyri and the sulci, the ridges and the grooves from the mid-sagittal view. One feature that you can now see that you couldn't see from the other view is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is this structure right here. And the corpus callosum is a dense white fiber tract that's millions of interconnecting neurons, and it serves to relay information between the two cerebral hemispheres, so between the left and the right sides of the brain. Some of the early treatments for epilepsy involved severing the corpus callosum, severing those connections between the left and the right side of the brain, and it's not something that we use as a treatment anymore. So those are the only features of the cerebrum that you should be able to see. In the diencephalon, that first region of the unconscious brain, I wish my mouse would move, there we go. You can see the thalamus, which is going to look like a raised egg-shaped structure here, and it's a relay center for sensory information to higher brain regions. And the hypothalamus, this sort of pointy triangular structure here that monitors the activities of the visceral organs. It regulates temperature. It controls the activity of the pituitary gland. So it's in the diencephalon, inferior to the thalamus, and superior to the pituitary, which would be dangling right where my cursor is. My cursor keeps freezing. Sorry, that's why I keep stopping talking. The next section is where my mouse is now. That's the mesencephalon, or the midbrain. It's the first portion of the brainstem, and it contains these features called the superior and inferior colliculi. These are two pairs that process visual and auditory information and generate reflex responses to those stimuli. And on here, it's labeled as the corpora quadrigemina, meaning the four bodies. That is the two superior colliculi and the two inferior colliculi. So collectively, they're called the corpora quadrigemina. And that's on the posterior side of the midbrain. Then if we keep moving inferiorly, and we get into the metencephalon, get into the pons, that prominent bulge of tissue that extends inferiorly from the midbrain and extends to the medulla oblongata. So this is the pons right here, and it's a relay station for information to and from higher brain regions and helps to coordinate breathing rhythms. Other portion of the metencephalon is the cerebellum, or the beautiful little brain, at the posterior aspect here. It's got a wrinkled surface, and it's involved in the maintenance of balance and coordinating movements. If you look at a mid-sagittal section through it, then you'll see these distinct white fiber branches, like that of a tree. Anatomists call these white fiber branches the arbor vitae, the tree of life. That's all in the metencephalon. And then if you keep moving inferiorly, you get into the myelencephalon, the medulla oblongata. It physically and functionally connects the brain and the spinal cord, and it's a relay center, as well as having respiratory cardiovascular centers, unconscious things that are keeping you alive. And it's connected down to the spinal cord. One more structure to be able to see is that pineal gland that's highlighted in pink right now. It's a small P-shaped structure that's anterior to the superior and inferior colliculi, and it helps to regulate those circadian cycles, releasing that hormone melatonin. You get a little bit of a closer look here. You'll be able to see some of these structures. So this right here, that's that white corpus callosum, axons that connect the left and the right hemisphere. And then the septum pellucidum is a division between the two lateral ventricles. Remember, the whole cerebrum is organized around the lateral ventricles. And other features back here, that pineal gland. Then there's the diencephalon, which is all of this, and the thalamus, which surrounds the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is what organizes that, the diencephalon. And then down below it, the hypothalamus, that master regulator of the endocrine system. And up here, this is the optic nerve and optic chiasm. That would be that X marks the spot when viewed from the inferior view. Here's the infundibulum, the stalk that the pituitary would be hanging from. And there's the mammillary body that's part of the diencephalon. So now you can think about how you're orienting yourself. To review the ventricles are those hollow spaces around which the brain is organized, and they're interconnected chambers that have cerebrospinal fluid traveling through them. So recall that there's the choroid plexus, which would be up in the lateral ventricle, where cerebrospinal fluid is produced, and then cerebrospinal fluid would flow into the third ventricle, where more cerebrospinal fluid is produced, and then flow through that cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, and then out into the central canal of the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord, or bathing the surface of the spinal cord and the surface of the brain. One thing that's a little bit confusing to think about is, if you're looking at this whole structure right here, then it looks like the thalamus, but it's also labeled as the third ventricle. How do you know what you're looking at? It's a little bit confusing, so I got another view to help out there. So the thalamus actually has two different sides. It's divided into hemispheres, like the cerebrum is. So this is one side of the thalamus, and this is one side of the thalamus. And the thalamus is a solid mass of tissues. Then between the two halves of the thalamus, that's where you'd find that one single third ventricle. So the third ventricle flattened between the two halves of the thalamus. You won't have to identify any brain features on a coronal section like this. I just wanted to show it to clarify where the third ventricle is in relation to the thalamus. So we've talked through a mid-sagittal view of the brain. I know this is really quick, but if you can try to quiz yourself and see if you can write down Or just think about what structures A through H are, as well as where you'd find the arbor vitae. And I'll give you a minute. Okay, I'm too excited. Hopefully for A, you told me that it's the corpus callosum, axons that are connecting the left and the right hemispheres of the cerebrum. For B, if I said, what is this massive tissue? You'd tell me that it's the thalamus. If I said, what is this cerebrospinal fluid filled space? You would tell me it's the third ventricle. C is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, where cerebrospinal fluid is being added. D is the fourth ventricle. E is the cerebellum, or if I said, what's this white stuff? You'd tell me it's the arbor vitae. So we've found the arbor vitae. F is the hypothalamus, part of the diencephalon. G is the pons, part of the metencephalon. And H, that is the superior colliculi, part of that corpora quadrigemina. So if you want to, now would be a good time to take a break and practice with the mid-sagittal brain, because I'm going to change gears and talk about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So the spinal cord, it's that inferior extension of the central nervous system, and it's like a large cable that physically and functionally connects the brain to peripheral tissue. The spinal cord is an integral component of central processing. It's often the first site of sensory information. So it's a highway of several 100,000 neurons sending information to and from the brain and target tissues. So the spinal cord is the route through which most information is going to be traveling on its descent to the effectors, and the route that sensory information is taking on its way to the brain. And as nerve cells enter or exit the spinal cord, they aggregate together, forming these discrete structures that are called nerves, bundles of axons in the peripheral nervous system. So the spinal cord itself is about 18 inches in length. It descends from the medulla oblongata down through the vertebral canal, and it terminates around the first lumbar vertebrae. This is because after the age of 4, the spinal cord stops growing, while the spinal column, the vertebrae, continue to lengthen. So the spinal cord is much shorter than the spinal column around it. Some features to identify is the cervical enlargement. This is a thicker region of the spinal cord. This is where the spinal cord is innervating the upper extremities, a lot of nerves going to the arms, hands, and fingers. So it's enlarged in that area. And the lumbosacral or lumbar enlargement. This is the thicker area where the nerves branch off to supply the lower extremities. Right below that is the conus medullaris, where the spinal cord tapers off, forming a cone shape. And then extending down from the conus medullaris are the remaining spinal nerves, which serve the lower extremities. And they look sort of like the tail of a horse, a lot of long hairs traveling together. So they're called the cauda equina, the horse's tail. So here is a view of the spinal cord with that cervical enlargement traveling down, and then a lumbosacral enlargement into the conus medullaris, that tapering, and then into the cauda equina, which goes out between the lumbar vertebrae, the sacral vertebrae, and into the coccygeal vertebrae. So here's a cadaver view of that cervical enlargement. This is what the spinal cord looks like. The bones have been removed that would be protecting it, showing just the spinal cord and some of the roots of the spinal nerves emerging from the spinal cord. And in the cervical region, this is what the spinal cord would look like. You have white matter around the outside, gray matter forming horns on the inside, and then the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves and the ventral roots of the spinal nerves. So motor on the ventral side and sensory on the dorsal side, merging together to make one spinal nerve. And this is a cadaver view of that cauda equina, where the spinal cord has come to an end, but spinal nerves are still traveling through the vertebral canal, and they look sort of like a horse's tail. So here's another illustration showing that conus medullaris, where the spinal cord has tapered off around the first lumbar, second lumbar vertebrae. And then there's this space where the cauda equina travels. That's called the lumbar cistern, and it tapers down all the way down at the coccygeal vertebrae. So the spinal cord is also surrounded by those three meninges that surround the brain. That is dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater and the arachnoid mater both are continuing all the way to the end of the spinal column, even though they're no longer surrounding the spinal cord. What they're doing is creating this space, this cistern, that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So the subarachnoid space continues and it encloses the cauda equina, and it forms this cistern that's full of cerebrospinal fluid. If you've ever heard of a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture, that's where somebody is getting a sample of cerebrospinal fluid taken. This is a dangerous procedure, right? Because this is the fluid that only surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. So it can be hard to get a sample of. You don't want to insert a needle around the brain because you might damage it. Don't want to insert a needle in the region of the spinal cord because you might damage it. So this area right here, the lumbar cistern, where the cauda equina is, it's the safest place to get a needle in to get a sample of cerebrospinal fluid. So if somebody's getting a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture, there's a needle that's going in between the spinous processes of the adjacent vertebrae, in through the dura mater, in through the arachnoid mater, and drawing a sample from this space right here. The pia mater, that innermost meninge, it covers the entire surface of the spinal cord really tightly, and it covers the conus medullaris, but it doesn't end where the spinal cord ends. Instead, it extends downward all the way to the end of the spinal column as this slender strand illustrated in orange here. This is called the filum terminale, and this anchors the spinal cord to the sacrum. So traveling within the cauda equina is this one single strand of pia mater that attaches the conus medullaris to the sacrum. And here's a view of those three meninges around the spinal cord. You can see the dura mater, that tough mother, the outermost layer, the arachnoid mater, the spider-like mother, and below it would be the subarachnoid space, and the pia mater, really close with the surface of the spinal cord. And then down here is another point of clinical interest. So this is a different view. This is a transverse view. So there's the spinal cord. It would have the pia mater on the surface, the arachnoid mater, forming that subarachnoid space filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and then the dura mater, that tough mother, around the outside of all that. And then superficial to the dura mater is this fat-filled space, and this is called the epidural space. So epidural above the dura. And you might have heard of an epidural in the context of anesthesia in childbirth. So an epidural anesthetic is a common procedure for pain relief during childbirth. And what happens is that the needle goes into that epidural space, that fat-filled space that's superficial to the dura mater. So this serves to block the nerve impulses from the lower spinal segments and results in a loss of sensation, including the sensation of pain, by blocking the transmission of signals through those nerve fibers that are in or adjacent to the spinal cord. So it would be, again, inserted between the spinous processes of adjacent vertebrae, but an epidural is only going to the epidural space, whereas a spinal tap or a cerebral or a lumbar puncture, that would be going all the way into the subarachnoid space. So epidurals just into that epidural space. Those are two procedures that are commonly confused. So within the spinal cord, there's this arrangement of white and gray matter, with white matter on the outside, gray matter on the inside. And all of these neurons, these axons, are either carrying sensory information from the peripheral tissue to the central nervous system. And those had to be ascending or afferent. And then neurons within a nerve that are carrying motor information to control target tissue cell activity. They're called descending or efferent neurons. So sensory neurons enter into the spinal cord as a collective group that's called the dorsal root. So that's on the dorsal, also known as the posterior side. So this is all dorsal. And then the motor neurons are exiting the spinal cord as a collective group that's called the ventral root. And for our purposes, we're going to say that basically everything that's on the dorsal side is going to be sensory, and everything that's on the ventral side is going to be motor. So the dorsal horn, this gray matter, that's responsible for the cell bodies that are sending sensory information. And the white matter, that's going to be axons that are sending sensory information. On the ventral side, the gray matter is going to be the cell bodies of motor neurons, and the white matter, that's going to be the axons of motor neurons. So within the spinal cord, you have gray matter, that's cell bodies, and these are called horns. And you have white matter, those are axons, and these are called columns. Remember that columns are just tracts bunched together, and tracts are just bundles of axons. So if I asked you, what are you going to find in the dorsal horn, you would tell me it's gray matter. That means it's cell bodies and dendrites. And because it's on the dorsal side, then you know that it's sensory, that it's afferent, that it's ascending, carrying information to the central nervous system. On the ventral side, if I asked you, what are you going to find in this column right here? You're going to tell me I know column is white matter. White matter is axons. And because it's on the ventral side, I know that it's axons of motor neurons. It's descending, it's efferent. So on the dorsal side, always sensory. On the ventral side, always motor. One way to remember this is by remembering the acronym SAME-DAVE, which tells you sensory, afferent, motor, efferent, dorsal, afferent, ventral, efferent. So sensory and afferent mean the same thing. Motor and efferent mean the same thing. Dorsal is always going to be afferent. Ventral is always efferent. So in both the spine and up into the brain, in the medulla oblongata, the back, that is dorsal, posterior, is always sensory. The front, or ventral, is always motor. And that's true for the spinal cord itself, as well as the roots that are entering into the spinal cord. So the dorsal root is on the back, dorsal, afferent. Sensory is afferent, so you know dorsal is sensory. It's going in, as indicated by that teal arrow. Ventral is headed out, as indicated by that red arrow. And that's always going to be efferent or motor. So take a minute to see what you can identify. I know that we haven't gone over some of these yet, but maybe you've been looking ahead at the spinal cord. So I'll stop talking for a little bit. So number one up here, there's just a little indentation. And then if you look on the other side, there's this really big indentation. When you see just a little indentation, you're on the posterior or the dorsal side. So this one is the posterior median sulcus. Number two, you know you're on the dorsal side and you're looking at gray matter. So it's going to be a horn. This is the dorsal horn right here. That's going to be cell bodies of sensory neurons. Number three is the lateral horn. You're only going to see a lateral horn in the thoracic region where you have your sympathetic nervous system. Then number four, we're still on the dorsal side, and it's a root that's wrapping around. That's the dorsal root. So that's going to be sensory neurons. Number five, now we've gone to the ventral side. This is the ventral horn. That's the gray matter for motor neurons. Number six is the dorsal root ganglion. Number seven is the ventral root. Number eight is that really big dip into the spinal cord. That's the anterior median fissure. I'm going to say that number nine is all of this. That would make it the anterior white column. So that would be axons of motor neurons because it's on the anterior or the ventral side. Number 10 and number 14 are both the gray commissure. And this is a little tiny bridge of gray matter that's connecting the left and the right sides. Number 11 is the central canal, a hollow space that cerebrospinal fluid is traveling through. Number 12 is this lateral white column. Number 13, that would be hard to guess, but it's the dura mater that's surrounding the outside of the spinal cord. And then 14 is that gray commissure again. So for our purposes, what you need to be able to do is look at the spinal cord and identify ventral from dorsal. And one way to do that is by looking for this really big fissure into the spinal cord, and that's always going to be on the ventral side. Another thing that you can look for are these dorsal root ganglia, which are going to make this dorsal root much thicker than the ventral root. And that'll tell you dorsal from ventral. Then know that dorsal is afferent, is sensory, and ventral is motor, is efferent. This might be another good time to pause the video and take a break, but if you want to keep going, then you can keep going with me. And I'll be going over the cranial nerves. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and most of them can be seen from the ventral surface of the brain. You're going to be responsible for identifying the 12 cranial nerves, knowing their name and their number, and knowing whether they're sensory or motor or both. So knowing something about these 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The first one you already know from looking at the ventral surface of the brain. They look like antennae. These are the olfactory nerves, they're sensory nerves, and they're cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerves are always numbered with Roman numerals, which can be a little bit confusing if you haven't seen them before. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. It's responsible for the sense of vision. Cranial nerve 3 is an oculomotor nerve. It's responsible for moving some of the extrinsic muscles of the eye. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve, which also moves the eye. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve, which has sensory and motor functions, a really big nerve. Cranial nerve 6 is the abducens nerve, which again moves the eye, so it's just a motor nerve. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. It's responsible for moving muscles of the face. Then we jump from the bottom here to up here to the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8, which is responsible for the sense of hearing and equilibrium in the inner ear. Cranial nerve 9 is glossopharyngeal, which has motor and sensory function. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve, that really big nerve that essentially is the parasympathetic nervous system. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory or spinal accessory nerve, a motor nerve for muscles of the neck. And then cranial nerve 12 is hypoglossal, which is responsible for moving muscles of the tongue. This probably seems like a lot to memorize. So if you need some mnemonics for knowing the cranial nerves, knowing their names in order, you can remember just this phrase, which I really like. It's not in your lab manual, but it's my favorite mnemonic for the cranial nerves. And it's, oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are happening. And that's the first letter of all 12 cranial nerves in order. So if you can remember, oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are happening, you'll know the first letter of all the cranial nerves in order: olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. There's 3 O's in a row at the beginning, which can be difficult to remember until you remember cranial nerve number 1 is olfactory. You have 1 nose. Cranial nerve 2 is optic. You have 2 eyes. And that leaves oculomotor as number 3. If you want to remember their functions in order, that is, are they sensory nerves, or are they motor nerves, or do they have both sensory and motor functions, then you can remember this phrase. And this is, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. And then you'll remember that it's sensory, sensory, motor, motor, both, motor, both, sensory, both, motor, motor. So if you can remember these 2 phrases in order, then you'll remember a lot about the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The last thing is being able to identify the location of the cranial nerves from a diagram or from a cadaver view. And a couple of them you already know. You know that the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, is this one that's traveling along the inferior surface of the telencephalon. You know the optic nerve is this X marks the spot at the diencephalon. Then the oculomotor nerve is this little spindly spaghetti noodle right here. So it's moving just some of these small muscles that move the eye. So it's really small. The trochlear nerve, nerve number 4, is also really small and spindly and emerging from the side of the pons. So it's just moving some of those small muscles that move the eye. That's number 4, the trochlear nerve. Then from the side of the pons is the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, which is really big, really distinct on either side of the pons there. Then cranial nerve 6 is the abducens nerve. This is at the junction of the pons and the medulla. This is another little spindly nerve that just moves some of the muscles that move the eye, so it's really small. Then if you move along the edge of the medulla, you get most of the rest of the cranial nerves in order. These next two, 7 and 8, they're emerging right next to each other at the pons medulla junction. That's the facial and the vestibulocochlear nerve. And these are often tangled up right next to each other. You won't be able to distinguish between 7, the facial nerve, and 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then 9 and 10 are also sort of tangled together. So the number 10, X, that's the vagus nerve. It's that really big nerve that is most of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so most of these fibers that are coming out of the side of the medulla, I am waiting for my mouse to unfreeze. There we go. So most of these fibers that come out of the side of the medulla, most of them are going to be cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, and just one little piece of it is cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal. So you won't be able to tell glossopharyngeal from vagus nerve. Cranial nerve 11 is the spinal accessory or accessory nerve, and it's emerging from the sides of the spinal cord. So it's emerging from as the medulla is changing into the spinal cord or changing names. So it's along the side there. And then to get number 12, the hypoglossal, you have to jump up onto this ventral surface of the medulla, and that's the hypoglossal nerve. It's off of that surface of the medulla there. So they're mostly in this anterior to posterior order. So if you know where to look and what to count, then you'll be able to figure out what nerves they are. So again, 1, this antenna up here. 2 is the X marks the spot. 3 is this spaghetti noodle right here. 4, this little spindly one off of the side of the midbrain. 5, this big nerve off the side of the pons. 6, a spindly one that starts the count down the side of the medulla. 7 and 8, also at that pons medulla junction. 9 and 10, tangled together on the side of the medulla. 11, off of the sides of the spinal cord. And then number 12, make a jump up onto the surface of the medulla on that ventral side. So you'll want to be able to identify them on a picture or on a cadaver view. For the ones that you can't tell apart, like 7 and 8 or 9 and 10, I would ask you, what 2 nerves are here. So be able to tell me the name of the nerve, the number of the nerve in Roman numerals, as well as is it sensory, motor, or both. And just remember that, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are happening. So for practice with all of the stuff that we just talked about, you can go through Lab 24 in your lab manual and complete the exercises at the end of the lab. That's page 11, 12, 13, and that's it.